Welcome to AWS Step Functions with Nodejs. Today, I have something very fascinating and interesting for you. This is a tool that people in cloud platforms and also people with full stack development very vastly use and very productive tool in AWS Arsenal. So today we are going to talk about AWS Step Functions and some other operations using Node.js platform. So basically, Step Function is a queue management tool, which means it is a serverless orchestration service that lets you combine AWS Lambda functions and other AWS services to build business critical applications. Step Functions graphical console shows that the application workflow as a series of event driven steps. AWS Step Functions is a low code and visual workflow. So which means like we don't have to do lines and lines of coding to build an entire state machine. We can simply drag and drop items and components together and build a workflow to execute when we need to. These workflows manage failures, retries, observability, and observations so that developers can focus on automating systems and automating processes rather than manually managing each and every step of the process or a segment of that certain application. So step function are based on state machines and task. So state machine is a workflow. A task is a state in a workflow that represents a single unit of work that another AWS service performs. State machine is a whole set of instructions and a task is a one line of instruction that refers to certain application or a certain service in the AWS console and other AWS services that we can use in the step functions. So with step functions, built-in controls, we can examine the state of each step in our workflow to make sure that the application runs in order to have an expected outcome, which means let's say we are going through an application and we need some reference where that this thing can go wrong. In that case, we can refer to the each state and each task of the application and we can identify and determine where the issue happens and what is the issue occurring and so on and so forth, so that we can easily identify and fix the issues that we are facing in the development platform of the application. For an example, they can be fully automated using step functions and we can like simply update into our AWS server and then run them forever, that we don't have to do much of work rather than simple maintenance and simple debugging once in a while, so that we can automate all these services in the process. A main benefit of using AWS Step Function is the simplicity of the framework and the platform. Simply we can build and deploy applications rapidly rather than working on them months and months in order to get the fixture and a proper outcome. We can simply get started quickly with the Workflow Studio and a simple drag and drop interface. With Step Functions, we can code event-driven workflows that connect services, systems, or people within minutes. So which means let's say we have several Lambda functions and some other S3 event triggers and some other stuff in the process. So we need to put all them together and build a workflow to our application. Then we can simply drag and drop those application in the AWS Step Function Workflow Studio and we can build a simple step function using those tools. Next thing is write less integration code, which means when we deploy a step function, AWS resources from over 200 services including Lambda, ECS, Fargate, Batch, DynamoDB, SNS, SQS, SageMaker, so on and so forth. All these services, we can simply creating each one of them in each scenario. We can simply drag and drop them and we can modify them as to our liking rather than simply integrating each one step by step and making sure that they work. That is a huge upside to step functions and usage of step functions in the application process. Next benefit is we can build fault tolerant stateful workflows, which means step functions can have positive outcomes and negative outcomes when we go through the workflow. So they can manage states, checkpoints, and restart for if there are any changes or issues in our workflow, which means we can have a certain point of the step function that checks whether we have the correct outcome. If we doesn't have it, then we can move back to top and again redo the whole after that checkpoint. So that is a main benefit and advantage of the step functions, because that decision making point and that checkpoint in the step function, which can be used as a automation tool, which means like it doesn't matter, we can simply automate it if it is not beneficial, if it is faulty. So we can use it as a fail-safe mechanism in the step functions and make them as much more automated and simply improve our application as automated system. Simply in the other final case, the step functions provide two workflow types, standard or express, that can be used depending on our specific use cases. Standard workflow is used to manage long-running processes in a much larger scale of application. We can use it to longer times and needed less maintenance rather than express workflows. Express workflows supports high volume event processing workloads, which means their life cycle will be much smaller, but they will support much larger workload in the process of development the application. Moving into a simple overview of the step functions, this is a simple example that we can take. So let's say there's a step function to manage our inventory and a billing system. So we can have it like this. In the first step, we are checking the inventory and the whole product, which means we are check whether we have the certain product that user requires. We'll build with them for that product and update the inventory for that. If the payment and transactions go through successfully, then it will move to the shipping phase of the development application process. If it is doesn't go through the payments, then it will remove or hold the order until the user completes the transaction. So this is a simple, straightforward state machine that we can use to automate a system. Also, we can use something like branching pattern, which means there might be multiple options that we can use when person do some ordering. Let's say customer place an order from our application for credit increases, which means application. So there can be two choices like this. If it is choice one, then it will process afterwards straightforward single line state machine and automatic approve and email the notification. If let's say the certain condition passes and it follows the second branch of pattern, then it will have a different set of instructions and different set of actions, and it will outcome a different output for the user. Also, the error handling process, it also a very unique process that we have in step functions. As I mentioned earlier, if there's some other failure in the step functions, then it will retry, or else if we can't retry immediately, then again it will automate and goes back to the starting process and then follows it again until we get the outcome, and it will CloudWatch regarding the certain issue and certain error occurs at the certain time, so that if there are any concerns, if there are any errors, we can fix them manually rather than waiting for a response from the customers and stuff. This is a simple snapshot of the workflow studio. As mentioned here, we can simply use many of these services that mentioned in the AWS platform, and we can use them to build a simple step function using these applications and using these services, and they will be passed on to each step, and each step will get an input and get put out an output. Then the output pass on to the next step as the input, like such it will pass on. Also, this is a sample code for a code-based step function, which means we can use serverless platform or a simple JSON file to build a step function, and we can provide the certain methods and rules in these steps. In here, this is the starting point of the step function, which means it is pointing out start at pass, which means this step, and states are as follows. The state is pass and it has some certain attributes, and the second state is hello world example and it had some certain attributes, and from herewards it's multiple branches are there, so it either can yes or else no. If it is yes, then it will pass on to the other values as well. So following are some use cases of step function that we can simply use them in our day-to-day life. First thing is ETL automations, which means automate extract, transform, and load process in our application, which usually those processes are done manually by a certain person in a certain area. We can simply automate these processes and provide instructions and steps to follow, and if there are any issues or concerns, then they can simply provide answers in that point. Second thing is machine learning. In machine learning, we have to ensure the data set is clean and clear and the certain columns with the dependent variable and independent variable. So these processes can be tedious because we have thousands of lines in our data set, and the preparation of this process can be very tedious. So we can automate this process and use a step function to automate it and clean our data set in matter of seconds rather than spending days on cleaning the process. And the use case is the microservices. Orchestrated microservices in step functions is very vastly used application. We can use step functions to combine multiple AWS Lambda functions into responsive serverless applications and microservices, which means we can simply build a backend using these microservices which used in AWS, and service that run on like EC2 instances, containers, or another premises services using step functions as well. So these applications and these processor that we discussed in step functions, they can be, when we create and deploy a step function, it lives on our AWS server, and we can use a Nodejs backend to access and manipulate the value. So we can use a Nodejs function. We can trigger some steps, we can trigger step functions and manipulate values, so add values step functions using a Nodejs. This is an example. We are using step function property in the AWS SDK start executing the step functions, or else we can update the step functions, and there are some other terminology terminologies and some other manipulations and values that we can do, and we can pass on our state machine ARN, which is the address of the state machine that we hosted in our AWS server, as the parameters and other inputs that we can pass on to the step function as well. Also, we can use a Node.js for write test cases also. Let's say we have a step function and we need to write a test case using Jest or Mocha or some other framework. Then we can use Node.js to write those as well using certain libraries like step functions. In Jest test case, we can pass our inputs and get determine the certain outcome, and we can compare them and check whether our step function works. So this is a brief overview of AWS step functions and how they work and how can we use them, and also how can we access them using Node.js and backend platforms. Okay, thank you guys for joining. Have a good luck.